Thank you, Maddie. Welcome to Johnson Consulting Conversations, where we dive deep into trends, challenges, and opportunities that are shaping funeral service professionals each and every day as they serve families. And today we're exploring a topic that's becoming increasingly critical for funeral homes across the country, and that's aftercare. Our guest today is Allison Dunn, Business Operations Manager for Johnson Consulting Group, with 4 years of experience in business development and team coordination, plus a background in psychology and human physiology from Arizona State University. Allison brings a very unique perspective to understanding how funeral homes can better serve families long after the service ends. Allison, welcome to the show. Before we dive in, I'd love to hear more about your role at Johnson Consulting Group and what drew you to focus on aftercare specifically.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lacey. I really appreciate it. Yeah, a little bit about my role. At Johnson Consulting Group, I really center on working to help develop and manage tools that can help those in the death care profession measure and improve their business. And we do that through real-time actionable data and collecting that data. And of course, we also want to make sure that we're focusing on helping clients to ensure that they're creating those lasting connection with those families that they're serving. So performance trackers are proprietary survey software, and we do a lot of sales analytics through that as well. And it really plays a very critical role in collecting family feedback and employee engagement across the businesses that we work with. So really the goal is to help them understand what's working in their business, what's not working, where and how they can grow and improve, but really beyond the numbers. What we're really tracking are the experiences. We're tracking those emotions, that long-term satisfaction of the families that are being served. And I think that's probably what drew me to aftercare most. It's where we see that true impact of where empathy and service quality meets. And when a family shares that they felt supported, not just at the time of loss, but for the weeks and months following that funeral service, that's a really clear sign that the clients are doing more than just meeting the expectations, right? They're building those meaningful, lasting connections within their community. So I guess long story short, at the heart of it, my work is really about using the data to drive just that compassion and that accountability so that we can help funeral businesses improve how they serve their communities, not just at that moment of loss, but long afterwards.
Let's dive into the big picture of the empathy and support that funeral homes provide families. From your work with funeral homes nationwide, what are the most common aftercare approaches that you're seeing among our Johnson Consulting clients?
Yeah. So every year we put together a report that is analyzing the data that's collected in our softwares, and the report's called Trends and Insights. And in this year's report, we found that 71% of people chose a funeral home due to some sort of personal experience or personal interaction or recommendation. And that's huge, 71%, right? And that really highlights, I think, the importance of a funeral home reputation, and that it hinges not just on that service provided at the time of death, but also on the ongoing care that's being offered, before, during, and after that funeral. So aftercare is really going to be essential in building those long-term relationships with the families to ensure that they're going out in their community and they're recommending your business at every chance that they can. And then, of course, that they're using your services generation after generation. And when it comes to those aftercare approaches, though, I do think there are a couple key strategies that really stand out. First is offering services that can address those specific needs of the families following the funeral. So that can be things like asset or estate settlement, or helping them overcome that mountain of paperwork that's always involved anytime there's a loss, or probably one of the most popular, which is going to be grief support. And that can be provided through educational resources and in-house specialists, or even community partners and vendors. But what's equally as important as those services are going to be those aftercare services that really serve to maintain contact with the family long after that funeral. So that can be things like text messages, follow-up calls, greeting cards, personalized letters, like really any form of communication that allows the funeral home to maintain that relationship with the family, and not just as a business, but as a compassionate entity that really genuinely cares about the family. So, I mean, that's going to further solidify trust. It helps demonstrate that the funeral home values the family beyond the service itself. And those small acts can really leave a lasting impression on the families that you serve.
That's fascinating, especially the statistic about 71% of families choosing a funeral home based on previous experience or recommendation. It really drives home how aftercare is more than just about being nice. It's about business sustainability. And of course, you used my favorite word, building trust with families. I want to talk about where funeral homes may be falling short. What are some of the biggest gaps that you notice in aftercare services offered by funeral homes?
Yeah, so a few things come to mind. I think one of the biggest gaps that I see is simply like a lack of aftercare, either
Mm.
that or an inconsistent approach with their aftercare strategy. So you really have to have a very clear, sustainable, and repeatable structure for aftercare, or it becomes very difficult to ensure that every family is receiving that same high standard level of care. And a family might have an exceptional experience leading up to or even during the service, but if communication suddenly stops afterwards, or if some of those key deliverables, like the death certificates or cremated remains or the merchandise, things like that are delayed, that family can really be left wanting. And that can overshadow that positive experience they had, especially during a time when they're still navigating grief. Another really common issue is that aftercare can often get deprioritized.
Mm.
If you're having to do it manually, it can be really time consuming, like handwriting notes, tracking follow-ups, contact information across spreadsheets, sending updates. All of that manually takes time. And that's time that, a lot of funeral professionals just simply don't have when they're juggling the needs of multiple families. So that's why platforms that can help automate or personalize that approach can be incredibly helpful. And they really ensure consistent and personalized communication with adding more to what's probably already a very full plate.
That inconsistency really stands out to me on
Definitely.
that. Yep, it's even the well-intentioned funeral homes, they can inadvertently damage relationships if they don't have the systems in place. And speaking of what works, let's flip this around and discuss what families are actually responding to from your experience. What specific aftercare gestures or services do families value most highly?
Yeah, in my experience, families really value just meaningful and timely communication. I mean, especially during those moments when they're feeling most alone. Obviously, it's going to be essential to keep communication clear and consistent when there are still those deliverables pending. But it's really those thoughtful gestures after some of those logistics are handled that leave the deepest impact. So, one of the most powerful examples I've seen through our SMS Aftercare platform is the response to birthday and anniversary messages. And I know that, those messages may not seem like much, but those messages often arrive months after the service, at a time when maybe outside support has typically started to fade. Friends and extended family members, maybe they've kind of moved on a little bit. There are just less check ins, but that doesn't mean that the grief is gone. So when a funeral home reaches out on some of those big milestone dates, it sends a strong message that you're still remembered and they still care about you. And I've seen messages where families respond with like, that means so much more to me than you know, or you're the only person who remembered. And that's incredibly moving, right? And it really shows how those small, simple gestures can make a lasting emotional impact for these families.
Personally, the birthday and anniversary messages are so powerful, especially when the reply is, "You're the only one who remembered." That really illustrates how funeral homes can fill that gap even close family members and friends that might miss it. Now, for funeral directors that have joined us today who want to implement any of these certain techniques or gestures or services, what is the optimal timeline for aftercare touch points with grieving families, and what types of aftercare messages work best for the SMS format?
Yeah, so anytime you create a timeline, you really have to take into consideration your unique client base, right? So you have to consider their cultural, their religious traditions. Um, Grief is definitely not one size fits all, and neither is aftercare. But that said, I do think there are a lot of thoughtful or key milestones that can help when you have that well-timed communication. So first off, there's probably going to be that 1 to 2 week time frame, and at that point, that's really just going to be a compassionate check-in. Just a simple message or a phone call asking how they're doing, if they have any questions, if there's anything that they need at all. Then there's going to be, the 2 to 4 week range. And at that stage, families can often start beginning to feel that emotional weight of the loss a little bit more intensely because daily life has started to resume. Those check ins, those connections maybe are lessening a little bit. So that's really an ideal time to share some grief support resources, whether it's support groups or articles or community counselors or any type of digital grief support resources. So, providing that type of resource can really show that you're thinking ahead to the family's long-term well-being.
That's a comprehensive roadmap, and I especially appreciate that you mentioned that grief isn't a one size fit all, and that cultural considerations do matter. That brings up a delicate balance. How do funeral homes balance being supportive without being intrusive during the grieving process? And I like that compassionate check-in phrase that you used.
Yeah, so I mean, balancing that sensitivity can definitely be one of the more delicate aspects of aftercare. And the family's relationship with the arranger is incredibly unique. It provides a great foundation for that welcome, thoughtful follow up. So I think the most important thing you can do is really take the time to gather that information about their aftercare needs in the arrangement room. Embrace that conversation around aftercare. Ask them things like, I'd really like to check in with you occasionally after the service. Would that be okay? Let the families know what type of support you offer and when they can expect that communication, because setting that expectation up front can make it so much easier for grieving families to engage without feeling overwhelmed. And then, of course, if someone is not interested in aftercare services, just respect those boundaries. That's okay. Just reassure them that that support is available should they ever change their mind if they need anything.
Setting expectations up front, that is such great practical advice. And speaking of different family needs, I imagine that those cultural and generational differences do play a huge role in what families find especially meaningful. How do those cultural and generational differences impact what families find to be meaningful during that aftercare period?
Yeah, every culture is going to have its own traditions surrounding death or mourning or that remembrance period. And some may observe extended grieving periods or have specific rituals on anniversaries or holidays or even unique customs related to how they handle the remains. So, and funeral homes, of course, that take the time to understand and honor that are going to have much more likely to build those lasting relationships within those diverse communities. But generational expectations absolutely also shape how families want to be supported after a loss. Older generations typically tend to value more traditional touch points, handwritten cards, letters, phone calls, maybe like memorial keepsakes that are sent to them in the mail, in-person grief support. So those gestures might feel much more personal to them and are more associated with that genuine care. Whereas with, millennials or Gen Zs who are now increasingly becoming those decision makers for funeral arrangements, they're more likely to seek maybe digital or on demand support. So they might like things like text message and email versus phone calls or online memorials or social media tributes. And that younger group can also tend to really value that transparency and the inclusivity that technology can bring, especially um, often expect to have easy access to information online and for the funeral homes to be able to acknowledge and communicate different ways to help support the diverse identities or family structures.
The generational shift towards digital communication is so incredibly important for funeral homes to understand. And speaking of digital text messaging, that seems to be gaining real traction in this space. How prevalent is the text messaging becoming in a funeral home aftercare program among JCG clients?
Yeah, text messaging is becoming very prevalent. I mean, and for very good reason. They're immediate, they're accessible, they offer convenience in a way that other methods simply can't match. Take mail, for instance, right? The average American receives over 40 pounds of junk mail every single year. Like, that's a lot of stuff that often just ends up in the recycle bin, especially now with online billing, paperless statements, different apps, right? So a lot of it just goes unopened. And for a lot of people, there's no reason to sort through it anymore. But contrast that with text messaging. Ask yourself, like, how many unread text messages do you have right now? And for most people, they're going to say, well, few, if any. And so text messages are just much more likely to be opened and read almost immediately. And from a practical standpoint, SMS really offers advantages that traditional mail and phone calls simply can't. So, for example, you are able to see instantly when a message has been delivered by a text message. And depending on your device, you can even see when the message has been read by the recipient. You can include things like links to grief support resources or memorial pages, and you can send that out to the families. And that can be less intrusive than phone calls, kind of giving families the space that they need to respond when they're ready to do so. But you can also, personalize that communication and automate it. So you can send out these messages on a very large scale, which saves a significant amount of time with aftercare services, but it still allows those messages to feel heartfelt. So I would say SMS, it's becoming incredibly prevalent throughout the space. Absolutely.
The contrast between 40 pounds of junk mail and how few unread texts we have, that is such a compelling way to think about it. So how are funeral homes actually integrating the text messages with their existing aftercare programs?
Yeah, so the text messages don't only act as a great way to stay connected with the family and send out information, but it's a great way to unify communication. So it's really become a natural extension of traditional aftercare methods. But as with everything else, collaboration, it's going to be critical. And if you're using more than one aftercare service, I just have to recommend, make sure that they're working together to ensure that the communication and outreach isn't overlapping. The last thing that you want to do is overwhelm the family when they're already going through so much. And also, one really, really important thing to note is make sure if you're incorporating text messages that you're following all privacy and communication laws, right? There are laws now like the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, and that dictates specific terms for being able to use text message-based communication. So that might be like only messaging during certain times of the day, getting explicit permission from families to message, and you have to be able to provide opt-out options. And if you don't do that, there's hefty fines. So definitely make sure you're following those regulations and that you're providing a wonderful support at the same time for your families.
That compliance piece is so crucial, and funeral homes definitely need to be aware of regulations like the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. Now, let's talk about the measurement. You mentioned Performance Tracker X for surveys earlier on. What percentage of Johnson Consulting clients currently use post-service surveys for their families?
Yeah, right now we're sitting right around half. So about 48% of our clients are incorporating Performance Tracker, our survey and sales analytics program, into their standard aftercare and operational workflows. So these firms are using that real-time data, and they use it to highlight strengths, close service gaps, drive long-term growth of their business. And those numbers do continue to rise, as more funeral homes are realizing that strategic value that those data-driven insights can bring. It's more than just a performance monitoring tool. It can truly be utilized as a business asset to support things like staff training and service delivery, operations strategy, strengthening your online reputation, and of course, you have to use it to generate on more leads, right? Bring those dollars through the door for your business.
Right about half is significant, and that is growing each and every year. For funeral homes that are considering surveys, what's the ideal timing for sending those surveys to families after services have been completed?
Yeah, so typically it's going to be around a 7 to 10 day window, and that's the buffer that we set within our own survey program. And that's really there just to ensure that the families are not receiving the survey until after the services have concluded. And that's really going to be the most critical concept there. Um, with that said, I mean, ideal timing is definitely going to depend on your point of sale system and your internal workflows. So, for example, if your system is triggering surveys based off of date of death rather than the service date, then we would recommend extending that delay out just again to avoid sending that survey too early, particularly in cases where the service might be scheduled days or even weeks after the death.
I would think that a 7-day buffer makes sense, and it gives families the time to process while the experience is still fresh in their minds. What specific questions do you think funeral homes should include in their surveys to gather the most valuable feedback?
Yeah, so you're going to want to choose questions that evaluate that overall experience, as well as highlight those areas for possible improvement so you can continue driving growth for your organization. So you're going to want a question that gauges how satisfied were they with those overall services and if they would recommend your business should that opportunity arise. You're going to want to touch on the perceived value that they have of your services based off the price that they paid. And that's going to be really important because you want to be able to identify if people are seeing the value in what you're offering. And if not, being able to break down, well, do we need to better express our value proposition? How do we cultivate additional value? Or do we need to adjust our service offerings or our pricing to gain better market share? And then, of course, questions that break down the components of that experience are going to be very important as well, right? So, if someone does report having a negative experience, whether it had to do with the initial welcome or maybe the care of their loved one or issues understanding the payment policy or any other number of things, you need to be able to identify where something went wrong and track if it's a singular incident or if it's an ongoing issue that's affecting your overall customer experience. And then, of
Those
course, you want to be able to generate leads, right?
Of
So,
course, definitely. Those are really strategic questions, and it's not just about satisfaction, it's about long-term satisfaction with the family. It's also about value perception and, of course, lead generation. What is the average response rate that you see for aftercare surveys, and what factors influence that?
so our current system response rate right now in this moment is 37.9%. And that's something that we're super proud of. Although I do have to say, our highest performing location right now is 72%, which is just mind blowing. I mean, that's so incredible. And those response rates, they really speak to how unique the funeral profession is and the relationship that the directors are forming with the families. Across other industries, it's 5 to 10% is what you see for a response rate. And that's considered pretty good. Um, as far as those factors that influence the response rate, I have to say, first and foremost, it's going to be your data. You have to ensure you're collecting accurate phone numbers, accurate email addresses, and mailing addresses for the families you're serving. If you're not getting that information into your point of sale system or whatever tracking method you utilize, then it really doesn't matter how wonderful your aftercare services are because your family's not going to benefit from them. They're not going to receive it. And then, of course, secondly, don't shy away from talking about aftercare in your surveys. Have a copy of that survey on your desk. Let them know they're receiving that survey in the coming days. Show them what the questions are going to be. Often, all it takes is just a 5-second elevator pitch for the survey, saying something like, your thoughts mean so much to us. And if you're comfortable, I'd really appreciate if you take a few minutes to provide your honest feedback so we can ensure we're doing everything we can for families during difficult times. And sometimes it's just that personal ask, right? Just that little 5-second pitch. And when it's someone the family trusts, they're going to significantly more likely to participate in completing that survey. And those locations that have that 50, 60, 70% response rate, that's what they're doing. And they're doing it with every single family, with every single director, and they're doing it very, very well.
Again, I really like how you encourage funeral directors to manage those expectations before that survey is sent to them. And also the 37.9% average, with some reaching 72%. That is incredible compared to other industries. Really speaks to the personal relationship that funeral directors forge with families, and it certainly does make a difference. How do the survey results impact online reviews and referral rates for the funeral home?
Yeah. So online reviews and referral rates, those are definitely two of the most critical drivers for long-term growth in this profession. In that Trends and Insights report, we actually found that 9.5% of all completed surveys generated an actionable lead. So that could be pre-need inquiries, grief support resources, or them just simply wanting other items like keepsakes or markers or burial plots. And those are touch points that could have been otherwise missed, right? So that extra follow-up that's prompted by the survey can lead to meaningful new connections and revenue. Now, when it comes to reviews, and I could probably talk about this all day, but in Performance Tracker, if a family reports having a positive experience, that's just the system can prompt them to leave an online review. And then if they agree, they're going to be immediately redirected to the funeral home's Google or Facebook page. So it makes it really, really easy that for the family just to simply follow through with leaving that review while the experience is still fresh and meaningful for them. And using a survey is really going to do two powerful things when it comes to safeguarding your online reputation. So one, it's going to encourage satisfied families to leave online public reviews. So it's going to really help strengthen that funeral home's online presence. And two, if there's an unhappy family or someone who had a less than ideal experience, it gives them a private space to express those concerns. Not everyone is comfortable voicing their concerns in person. So it's going to be really important to offer a solution that allows families to communicate the issues or the concerns they have in an area where they're comfortable, so staff can follow up and resolve those issues before they escalate to a public forum where it can damage your reputation. And obviously, Google reviews, they remain incredibly influential at this time. I am very curious to see where AI takes things, but as of today, they are still very influential. And when someone turns to Google and they just say something like, "Hey, Google, find me a good funeral home near me," the goal is that your business appears in that ranking with a very strong presence. And that means you have a solid number of reviews, right? They're not sparse, they're not negative, and that can immediately reduce the trust and significantly lower the chances of someone choosing your business if, in comparison to another organization, you have far less reviews or a lower ranking. But I do think it's really important to note that Google reviews are only part of that story. There are a lot of local community forums, and they're like Facebook groups, Nextdoor, neighborhood apps like Ring Marketplace. And those have become a very public square. In my own community, for example, we have at least 10 location groups just on Facebook alone. And by location specific, I mean, like, you have to live within a certain zip code area in order to join the groups, or that's what you're supposed to do, right? And each of these groups, they have thousands of members, tens of thousands of members. I think the highest one I looked at earlier was like 34,000 people that join that group. And I have about 45,000 people in my community. So that's a very large percentage. And every day people go on there and they're posting about their service experiences. I just saw one the other day that said, "Hey, I worked with this electrician. I had a really bad experience. Has anyone else had that experience? What should I do?" And dozens of people were commenting, hundreds of people were interacting with that post. So, and the difference between that and Google is that I get those notifications directly to my phone. I don't have to seek them out like you do with Google. So this is really critical. I can't undersell it. if a family has a negative experience and they're not expressing that to your team, it doesn't mean that they're staying silent, right? They may be sharing those experiences in these digital spaces instantly and very, very publicly, because they're connecting on a scale that didn't happen in previous generations. So without proper aftercare, without actively checking in or gauging satisfaction or working to resolve those concerns, you lose the chance to address those issues directly and are risking potentially reputational damage on a very large scale. So that's how aftercare can be so important, right? It allows you an opportunity to take those silent detractors and potentially turn them into future advocates for your organization.
And that Nextdoor app, it's as interesting as Facebook. But seriously, the ability to address concerns privately before they become public complaints, that is so incredibly valuable and certainly worth the investment of doing those post-service surveys. What strategies work best for encouraging satisfied families to leave a positive review or testimony?
Yeah, so the most effective strategy is also going to be the most straightforward. Oftentimes, you've just got to ask. Families are much more likely to leave a review when they feel like they've been personally invited to do so, especially when that request is coming from someone that they trust, like their funeral directors. So, really, just a genuine, heartfelt request made during a conversation or shortly after the service can make all the difference. And then, of course, it's going to be really essential to make sure that that process is really easy and convenient for the family. They're going to be far more likely to follow through if they're given a direct link to either your Google or your Facebook or something else, rather than them having to go in and search it out and, figure where on the Google page do I click in order to leave a review. So even small barriers like that, that can really prevent someone from taking action. And then, don't be afraid to ask for a gentle follow-up, or a gentle reminder. So just sending them like a quick text or an email a few days after, thanking them again, resharing that link. Sometimes that's really all it takes just to inspire them to actually go in and complete a response.
Simply ask is sometimes the most effective strategy of all because it is so straightforward. We've covered a lot of different topics within aftercare, but I want to talk about common obstacles that funeral homes do face when they're implementing a comprehensive aftercare program. What are those?
Yeah, one of the most common challenges, I think it really comes down to perception.
Mm.
The perception that aftercare could be difficult to implement due to either resources, whether that's, staffing or time or budget constraints. And it can feel like one more thing to manage, right? And again, we already have a very full plate. But when that aftercare, when it's reframed as a supportive tool and an extension really of the funeral home's existing service philosophy, that aftercare becomes much easier to adopt. It's not just an add-on then, right? It's a continuation of that care that builds that trust and that long-term relationship with the families. Another major obstacle oftentimes can be the learning curve associated with any new tool or technology, especially for a team whose members may not be as comfortable in that space. And that's why, clear training, very consistent and ongoing communication, and also breaking down the why, and how it's relevant to their day-to-day task is really going to be key. So when staff understand how aftercare impacts their daily role and why that matters, they're much more likely to become engaged and committed to its success. And then also another thing is culture. I think that's a really big role as well. Funeral homes who embrace aftercare as part of their internal culture and their level of care rather than just checking a box, they often see a lot better results. So that can be building enthusiasm through like recognition or fun incentives. And that can help really overcome any hesitation and create that momentum. So, doing celebrations, monthly spin to win games, highlighting directors on social media, all of that can help boost morale and participation.
That cultural piece is so incredibly important, and it has to be more than checking a box, like you said, and really communicating the why behind having a substantial and effective aftercare program is essential when you want to get everyone's buy-in at the funeral home. And I do imagine that smaller funeral homes, they do face unique challenges with limited resources, perhaps. How do you help smaller funeral homes with those limited resources or limited staff develop a bigger, more robust, sustainable aftercare program?
So ultimately, our approach is to help funeral homes really take the aftercare and embed that into the daily rhythm, without adding unnecessary stress. So just keeping it very simple, celebrating those wins, utilizing the right tools. And in that circumstance, then even limited teams can move forward and really deliver exceptional care after the service ends. We recommend building, of course, a very clear, repeatable process that integrates aftercare into those original workflows. And that might mean like automating touch points, right? Like those grief support messages or those holiday check-ins or those post-service survey platforms like Performance Tracker. So that reduces that level manual work for those teams. And then ICPs are going to be huge too. Incentive compensation plans can be very easily adapted for smaller teams. They don't need to be complex. They just need to be clear and measurable and tied to meaningful outcomes that focus the team on the right things for your organization. And, like with Performance Tracker, those team members can actually see their metrics in real time. So it gives them that immediate insight to know where they're falling and how that is impacting their work. So the system is really meant to encourage accountability and reward performance and help your team members stay focused on what matters most. And we actually see that, in that Trends and Insights report, we found that those smaller funeral homes with the, smaller communities or population size were really excelling in those areas when it came to, attention to detail and empathy and all of those things that really make a powerful experience for the families.
I like the focus on efficiency and integration, which is key for smaller operations, and also not making it complex. It needs to be simple for everybody on the team participating. It does obviously sound like a significant investment for some. How do funeral homes measure the return of investment of those aftercare practices?
You're really going to be using a mix of both quantitative data as well as the qualitative impact of that data. So, you're going to be looking at things like financial incomes as well as the long-term relationship building with your families and your staff. So one, of the most direct ways to look at ROI is probably going to be through that survey feedback. So we're going to help families gather that measurable data on family satisfaction and service quality. And it also ties it to those key performance indicators. So that might be things like how many perfect score surveys they received, or those staff specific performance metrics, the overall satisfaction of the families over time. Those types of insights really inform training, highlight strengths, pinpoint those areas for improvement, and drive better efficiencies within the organization. Another one is going to be your online reviews, your reputational growth, right? If a family is responding positively to your service or your surveys, that system can prompt them to leave a review. So that direct link between that private feedback and that public reputation can be a very powerful one, or, boost search visibility or credibility. And those funeral homes that consistently, receive those 4 or 5 star reviews, they do gain a competitive edge. And then of course there's going to be lead generation. How many leads are you getting? Are you closing those leads? What is that percentage of leads that are closing, and what kind of revenue are they generating for you? And then also with your staff. So you'll be able to look at things like your employee engagement, your productivity, your retention. So when aftercare can become a very positive part of your culture, supported by those recognition programs or those incentive compensation plans, staff are much more motivated to focus on delivering that exceptional service.
It's clear that the return on investment isn't just financial. It's about reputation, relationships, and long-term sustainability. As we wrap up, I want to hear your predictions for the future. Where do you see funeral homes uh, going in the direction of aftercare in the next 5 years?
Yeah, so I'm anticipating a much greater shift towards the use of technology, especially when it comes to things like grief support or those like AI powered check-ins, those memorial platforms, maybe online grief communities, as digital convenience and emotional accessibility become really important to today's consumers. Aftercare will kind of evolve into this ongoing personalized digital engagement rather than this one-time gesture. So I think what was once seen as a maybe nice to have, it's going to become a core expectation, particularly as those younger generations who value that follow through and that emotional support and the convenience that comes with technology become those decision makers. I think technology is also pushing people to adapt more data backed approaches. So using that actionable data, that real time data, and using tools that track satisfaction and log those follow-ups and identify those at-risk families. Those are becoming more available and more essential, because data doesn't just improve service. It informs training and market strategy and operational planning, right? So those metrics will increasingly be used to prove the value of the ROI of our aftercare programs.
That's incredibly interesting, and I think the use of data and funeral homes wanting that data and your insights from the data is going to be incredibly important as they move forward and incorporate new forms of technology to stay in contact with families. This has been incredibly insightful, Allison, and for our audience who want to learn more about Johnson Consulting Group's aftercare solutions, including the Performance Tracker X and the SMS Aftercare platform. Where can they find more information, Allison?
Yeah, I would love to talk to you more. I'd be happy to throw my contact information in the chat and we can get that out to you guys. And then, of course, our consultants are also such an amazing resource. I mean, between all of them, there are decades and decades of experience within the funeral profession. So it is always just incredible to see the amount of information that they have. So, of course, if you ever have an opportunity to sit down with one of them and pick their brains, that's going to be incredibly valuable as well.
And you have referenced the Trends and Insights report. I will have Maddie include the link to Taylor's breakdown of the insight report for everyone and include that in the blog summary as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, Allison, and sharing your expertise. And to our audience, remember that aftercare isn't just about being kind, it's about building those lasting relationships that ultimately drive referrals, build that reputation and revenue for years to come. That's all for today's episode of Johnson Consulting Conversations. I want you to save the date for August the 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll be joined by Deanna Wilkinson, Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Express Funeral Funding. You can always count on Johnson Consulting Group for more insights to help your funeral home thrive in the evolving industry of funeral service. Until then, keep serving families with excellence, and not just during their time of need, but long after. Thank you for joining us. And I want to switch over to Maddie and see what questions we have in the chat box.
Absolutely. So we did get one come through here. Also, I still can't get the 40 pounds of mail, like the visual out of my mind. But yeah, so a question came through here concerning the locations that average 72% response rates for post-funeral service surveys. What do you think is the most important factor in reaching that level of response?
Yeah, so I really think the most important factor, I mean, if you're already doing a wonderful job of getting those email addresses and those phone numbers, the biggest factor is simply going to be those connections with the families. So really making sure that you're having the communication with them about the surveys, letting them know it's important to you, letting them know how it impacts the business and how it impacts the families that you're serving. So again, sometimes it's just that 5-second elevator pitch for the families, asking them to participate. That is really all it takes. But you have to do it with every single funeral arranger, and you have to do it with every single family. So consistency is definitely going to be key in helping to drive that response rate and get the most value from any of your survey platforms.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Allison. That is all the questions that we have at the moment.
Thank you, Maddie. And again, save the date for August the 13th, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we will be joined by Deanna Wilkinson of Express Funeral Funding. Thanks, Maddie. Thanks, Allison, and see everybody in August.
Thank you so much.